scandal here in Washington, and Jimmy Carter, an outsider, ran and barely won against Mo Udall. And the governor of California then, he was called Governor Moonbeam. Governor Brown was running. He's still governor. He did not win, and Scoop Jackson, a variety of other people. The Democratic side is a little easier to analyze in the sense that we've got Bernie Sanders, a progressive far-left candidate, former Secretary of State and Senator Hillary Clinton, Governor Martin O'Malley, and Jim Webb has dropped out. Biden has decided not to run. So the central questions that I'm going to be asking our panelists is who's ahead right now and why. I think that's probably going to focus primarily on the Republican side. What are the major issues? Gallup poll before the tragedy of Paris happened rank ordered the most important issues from their surveys as the economy, the functioning of government, or the Washington culture, very close to the economy. People are very upset with Washington. The trust levels for the federal government and especially Congress are very low. Congress has a rating of 14.1% of people thinking it's doing a good or outstanding job. Now, McCain said the 14.1% are all the people on the Hill that were in the poll because he couldn't find anybody else that would say that. Health care policies next. Terrorism was next. It's likely to be at the top after Paris. Income distribution, foreign affairs, immigration, race relations. Immigration and terrorism may merge. It seems to be happening right now with the rhetoric. Another question that we're going to be exploring, discussing, is who's ahead in the money race, and does it really matter? A couple candidates don't really have a lot of money, Trump in particular, and he has been doing pretty well until lately. And what has been the impact of the debates? We have some polling on that. I think our colleagues here can address that. What's the role of demographic constituencies in 2006? The Latinos, African Americans, gender, the youth. You'll see that with Latinos, African Americans, women, and young people, they voted overwhelmingly, and Asians overwhelmingly for the Obama last time. Will that continue this time? We have 5 panelists that will address these issues. The panelists all have distinguished backgrounds either in applied politics, and by the way, we give a master's degree in applied politics here where people go out and work in survey research firms and in campaigns. We've got former graduates in almost all of the campaigns. First, I'd like to introduce Glenn Boulder. Glenn's a graduate of American University. He's co-founder and partner of Public Opinion Strategies. POS is a leading Republican pollster and strategy company. In this cycle, POS has 14 U.S. senators, 6 governors, and more than 80 members of Congress as clients. He's had super PACs as clients in the past. Glenn is the only pollster to be a 3-time winner of the Republican Pollster of the Year by the American Association of Political Consultants. He is also an adjunct and teaches for us regularly a course on survey research. Anna Greenberg, welcome Anna, is a vice president of Greenberg, Quinlan, and Rosner, and it's a Democratic polling firm. She's a research fellow with the center. After getting her PhD at the University of Chicago, she taught at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. She also won the Pollster of the Year award by the AAPC in 2014 for her work with Mayor Bill de Blasio. She's also, and I think you'll see in some of her comments, it's based on some of this work. She's also a leader in the growing field of data analytics and micro-targeting, measuring the impact of social media on public opinion. Jen Lawless, co-sponsor of this event, is the director of Women in Politics Institute. She's also an affiliate faculty with the Center for for Congressional Presidential Studies of the School of Public Affairs. She's nationally recognized for women in politics, but also ambition in politics. Her latest book has gotten great reviews, Running for Congress, Why Young People Are Turned Off to Politics, with Richard Fox. She's also the author of Becoming a Candidate, Political Ambition and Decision to Run. She was a candidate for Congress at one point. It's still, also her book, It Still Takes a Candidate, Why Women Don't Run for Office. She's got dozens of academic articles. I won't list all of them, but she has a solid academic background, a PhD from Stanford. Alan Lichtman, historian, a quantitative historian, which is rare. He's a distinguished professor of history here at American University. He has 16 books, including most recently The Keys to the White House in 2016. It's the 6th edition of this book, very popular. He also published the award-winning book FDR and the Jews with Richard Breitman. He has over 60 academic articles and PhD from Harvard. David Wasserman. David Wasserman is the House editor for the Cook Report. Now, how many of you know what the Cook Report is? Okay, half of you do. Let me say that that's where everyone goes to find out what's happening in the House, the Senate, and presidential race, because they do a meta-analysis of all the polls that they have access to, and frequently they have access to them within 7 to 10 days. It provides nonpartisan analyses of presidential, Senate, and House and gubernatorial races. David served as a NBC analyst for the election news decision desk for many years. Before he took the position at the Cook Report in 2007, he was the House editor for Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball publication, and he has recently written an important article about the politics and strategy of getting delegates, GOP delegates. It's not as clear as you would think, and he'll speak to that later. So let me begin by asking each of you a question. I'll start with Anna. The question I have for Anna is what has happened with these Democratic candidates? What are the most important issues? Some people say these two parties seem to be in two different universes in terms of the issues that they're talking about that are important. We know Hillary's ahead. How's she doing against Bernie in Iowa and New Hampshire? And what are the issues that are driving those campaigns? I'm sorry we don't have lavalier things. Let me make sure it's on.
Is this working now? Yeah, okay. Hi, how are you? Thanks. Well, I think that the Democratic primary is the not interesting primary this year. It looked like it might get a little interesting, particularly after the period of Hillary's announcement and then coverage of Clinton Foundation donors and then the email, quote unquote, scandal. Where you started seeing her favorability drop and Bernie Sanders, catching up to her, especially in places like New Hampshire. But I think that was because people sort of forgot that they liked Democrats, that is, forgot that they liked her, that she's competent, that she's smart, that she's experienced, that she's ready to be president. And I think when she, in the first debate, she did, she was excellent and I think was presidential and she looked vibrant and young-ish, which matters. Oh, she did, next to Bernie Sanders. And then I think the way she comported herself during the Benghazi hearings, again, she was, brilliant, and she looked great in stamina, and, people, Democrats in particular, you don't see much movement among other voters, but Democrats were reminded that she's actually someone they like, and they liked her a lot when she left being Secretary of State. So I think her position's incredibly solid. I would be shocked if anybody but her is the nominee. And I think that the issues that they're talking about get no attention whatsoever. So they sort of have, I think, a clean slate or a blank slate when they get when the Republican nominee emerges, even if they don't have the actual, even if it's not set, but there's a sense of who it's going to be. I think you'll start seeing the kind of stark differences between whoever the Republican nominee is going to be and Hillary. But until the Republican craziness is settled, it's just hard to see how anything Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders is saying gets much attention at all, which actually I think in some ways is an opportunity for her to raise her money, get her campaign set up, make sure she's putting out, her, what she's done a lot on the economy and other drug policy reform, and kind of get herself ready to take on this Republican. So again, I think the Democratic primary is relatively uninteresting. And I think there was a moment where it looked like it might be competitive, but I'd be stunned if it was anyone but her as the nominee.
How did she do in the debate?
Well, all the polls suggest that she won, and I watched it. It's the only debate I've watched. So, and she did, very, very well. There's been some coverage of the most recent debate that suggests that maybe she has some vulnerability around some of the things she said around terrorism and foreign policy and Wall Street, but those to me are really minor. I think that's people looking for something to write about, because there's just not that much to write about with these debates.
Thank you. So I'd like to go to Glenn. I don't know if this is on. Glenn, tell us about these 15 Republican candidates. And that will take 55 minutes, but I want you to do it in a short period of time. And the issues that are driving them compared to the issues that the Democrats seem to be focused on. So we're all wondering why Trump has done so well. He's going down a little bit now. Why Carson has done so well. Could you address that also, please?
Okay, so Anna goes out on a limb, predicts that Hillary will be the nominee, and then I get the tough question. Okay. First of all, it's great to be back at AU, particularly on such an august panel as this. I mean, everybody up here, I could just, set aside what I'm talking about and just listen to what they have to say, and I'd learn a heck of a lot. So it's great to be here. In terms of what's going on in the Republican primary, it's hard to see. When you look at Trump's numbers nationally, outside of the primary, it's just hard to see him having enough headway to be the nominee. His image at 25-58, 25 positive, 58 negative in the most recent Wall Street Journal, and that was before his meltdown this weekend, it's the worst of any major presidential candidate who was leading in a primary. Second worst ever in an open seat primary, Hillary Clinton. She has 48% unfavorable. The worst John McCain ever got was 39. His negatives were no higher in 2008 than 37. And going back to 2000, you had George W. Bush at 34%. You had Al Gore at 39%. His unfavorables, Michael Dukakis, his highest negatives were 43. So in recent open seat history, you haven't seen what we're seeing today. With the two front runners for each party. Now, on the Republican side, Trump's support is very different demographically than the majority of the party. So I think that's what makes it hard, and that's why I think he's hit a ceiling and come down a little bit. Carson's voters are much more women and evangelical than anybody else's. Ted Cruz is much more Tea Party and very conservative than anybody else's. Rubio does very well with older voters, and Jeb Bush's strength are with moderates, which is generally not the best way to win a Republican primary. So, when you look at those differences, it's really hard to project, what's going to happen. I think anybody beyond them, once you get through the proving ground of Iowa and New Hampshire, if, some of the other 15 who I did not mention are not, breaking out of low single digits, they're going to have to drop out. I mean, there's just no reason to continue their candidacy. It's amazing how long they've stayed in without making any headway so far. And in terms of the issue set, yes, the country is extraordinarily polarized. The difference between what Republicans care about in their top issue set and what Democrats care about, and we can talk about this more later, but it's totally night and day, totally, completely different.
Two different worlds. Let's pick up on the demographics, Jen. Obama had solid showings in 2008 and 12. with key demographic constituents. A little bit of data. Women supported him by 12 points, majority of 12 points. Romney led by 7 points with male voters. Youth, Obama won the youth vote nationally, 67% to 30%. Hispanics, 72% for Obama. African Americans, 93% for Obama. Asians, 75% for Obama. What's likely going to happen, and I know you focused on youth, what's likely to happen in the next election?
My youth weren't old enough to vote, so I can't really speak. to
Yeah,
that.
right. If they turn out, what's likely to happen with these constituencies?
So it's going to be the same thing that we're accustomed to seeing, right? There's not, regardless of who the Republican nominee is, it's not like this person all of a sudden is going to completely close the gender gap. We've had a gender gap in presidential votes since 1980. In every presidential election since 1980 and in all congressional elections since 1986, women have been more likely than men to support the Democratic candidate. So there's nothing to suggest that won't happen this time. And Hillary Clinton has an opportunity to exploit that and mobilize women. The question is the extent to which she'll be effective doing so. I mean, she's not a candidate that right now has much enthusiasm behind her. And so, she can make that gender gap even bigger. She can exploit that gender gap if she can rally people to turn out the way that Barack Obama did in 2008 and 2012. But in terms of the raw numbers and what we should expect from the exit polls, I can't imagine that young people, African Americans and women, are not going to support the Democrat.
Okay, thank you very much. And we move to Alan Lichtman, who sometimes rejects a lot of literature in political science, and he's come up with some indicators of the outcome of elections in his book. Can you tell us the key factors that you think will influence the outcome of this election, especially in the general election?
Actually, I am here to declare my candidacy for the Republican nomination for President of the United States. Why not? It's a wide open field, isn't it? No, seriously. Yeah. Can you sell one for me? Actually, I've tried to get everyone a copy of the keys. If not, I've got some extras up here. Jim is absolutely right. I have a system that is different from anything else you'll hear about, read about, or see in politics. In fact, when I first made my first prediction in 1984, when I was 9, Jim Thurber said, "All right, Lichtman, we now have to throw out all of political science because your system bears no relationship to what anyone else is saying or writing." Another one of my friends said, "Lichtman, I used to believe in free will. I don't anymore." My system is based upon the proposition that presidential elections, general elections, have nothing to do with campaigns, speeches, debates, ads, issues, parties, or for the most part, even candidates.
Wait a minute, Alan. We have a campaign management institute here where we send students out to do
All right,
the
I'm
campaign.
gone.
Thank you for your views.
Yes. Actually, the saving grace, Jim, is this only applies to presidential elections.
Oh, okay.
You can go out and send, your campaigners to Congress and the Senate. So my thesis is that elections are essentially referenda on the performance of the party holding the White House. If that party performs well, they'll get another 4 years. If they don't, the challenging party wins. In other words, imagine this, it's the real stuff that matters, the economy, foreign policy, scandal, social unrest, and this system has correctly predicted the outcome of the popular vote. You can ask me about 2000, I'll explain that. Since 1984, 8 elections in a row, and often long before. For the election of 2008, I was notorious for predicting that the Republicans would lose in 2005. In fact, I said the Democrats could pick a name out of the phone book and elect that person president. And that's kind of what they did. Whoever heard of Barack Obama back in 2005. Now, I wish I could tell you which party is going to prevail this time. But the keys are very difficult right now. Let's give you a quick rundown, and we'll see where they
We're
stand.
going to limit you to 1 minute.
This will take me 1 minute. Party mandate, false. Contest, probably true, but we don't know for sure. Incumbency, false. Obama's not running again, obviously. Third party, true. Unlikely a third party. Both economy keys, true. So that's 2 down. Remember, the way this works, 6 down, and the party in power, the Democrats, are out. Policy change, not this term. He got it last term. It's term by term. 3 down. No social unrest, no major scandal, no big foreign military failure, but no big foreign military success either. So that's 4 down. Incumbent charisma, well, we heard, Hillary is not a John F. Kennedy. That one is down. Challenger charisma, I don't see anyone on the Republican side. So that's 5 keys down for the Democrats. That means they have no margin for error. Right now, they'd be a predicted winner, but there are lots of keys that could still turn against them, which is why it's still too early. But now you have your hand out, and you know exactly what has to happen.
Thank you, Alan. We'll get back to some of those, we call them hypotheses in political science.
Way over my head.
Not absolute generalizations of truth. David Wasserman next, and finally at these introductory questions. You're an expert on the House, but you also watched the Senate, you also watched the presidential election. The House last time, I think, had a little over 30 seats that were competitive out of 435. It's safer than the Politburo in Havana these days, so I don't know what you do down there because you can predict all the elections before it gets started. The Senate is competitive this time. We've got about 6 to 8 seats of the Republicans that are competitive, maybe 4 or 5 of the Democrats. We'd like to hear a little bit about that. But importantly, I want to hear your views on delegate selection, that roadmap, because it's not as clear as just sort of winning in Iowa and New Hampshire and going into the super primary and doing well. It's more complex than that. David.
Well, thank you very much, and I'll save you my thesis on that for now, perhaps. But it's great to see this room packed. It's almost enough to lift me out of the funk from last night's UVA GW game, and I'm a Wahoo, so I walked out of there with my tail between my legs. But anyway, you hear all the time about how zany this presidential race and season is, and a lot of different theories of the race. And certainly, Alan, I appreciate your 8 keys. My theory on it might be a little bit more simple. I think Hillary Clinton is eminently beatable. If Republicans nominate Marco Rubio, I think they have an excellent chance of beating her. If they nominate Carson, Trump, or Cruz, they don't. Hillary is your president. I think we could be approaching a model of the presidential race that really is quite that simple. And I think the question of who's ahead on the Republican side in polls is a very different question than who's the front runner for the nomination. Right now we have 53% of Republican voters who say they support candidates with 0 elected experience. I think what that tells you isn't necessarily that Carson and Trump are going to win the nomination. It's that someone with a long paper trail in politics is probably not going to win the nomination. And I think Democrats are scared of Rubio in part because he could be the Republican Obama of 2016. The son of at least one immigrant, 8 years in a state legislature, runs for Senate against their party establishment frontrunner in a long shot bid, wins a Senate seat, becomes a star in their party, gets bored in their first term, relatively few accomplishments, decides to launch a long shot presidential run. The front runner is a member of the previous president's immediate family. The general election opponent is 24 years older and lost the presidential race 8 years before, besides the obvious of the barrier-breaking nature of their candidacies. I don't think there is a blue wall in the general election. If Republicans just moved 3% of the vote across the board, they'd be at 312 electoral college votes. And we can get into some of the delegate math, but I do think there is a natural advantage for a more pragmatic, mainstream Republican, in part because I think there would be a huge stop Trump, stop Cruz, stop Carson movement in the Republican establishment, and particularly in places where huge delegate amounts are at stake if they got very far.
So there are 10 battleground, 8 to 10 battleground states. I'd like anybody to jump in on this. 2 of them have a significant percentage of Latinos, 15% in Colorado, maybe more than that now in Florida. 250,000 new Puerto Ricans coming in that can vote right away that have come into Florida, I understand. Those two states are very important and to the outcome of the battleground states, and Latinos voted 72% last time for the Democrats. What's going to happen this time? Help me out.
The Latino Decisions just released a battleground poll today or yesterday. Latino Decisions just released a battleground poll. It's not a big sample, about 425 Latinos, but right now about 16% of Latinos think the Republican Party cares about them. About half think they actually are deeply hostile to them. I think this primary has not been helpful, particularly I think having Rubio having to repudiate all of his previous positions on immigration reform. I think that it would be very, very, Latinos are more likely than African Americans to vote cross-party. African Americans rarely vote for an African American Republican, but Latinos who are Democratic leaning and presidential, heavily Democratic, will vote for Latino candidates. You know, see Susana Martinez, Ted Cruz, Rubio, et cetera, all got significant chunks of the Latino vote. But I wonder if the last, really since 2010, but this primary in particular has been so ugly and xenophobic and, you know, led by Trump. But, you know, because of the pressures to be on the right, you don't have Cruz or Rubio, you know, really repudiating the sort of xenophobic comments being made by the others, and again, repudiating even some of the positions they had taken earlier on immigration reform. So I think, you know, Hillary Clinton is headed towards getting, you know, 72% again of the Latino vote.
You mentioned cross-party voting, ticket splitting, and according to you and Jen are on the American National Election Study, which we all use in political science, and we saw that we have the strongest partisan electorate really ever, with 93% of Democrats voting for Obama, 93% voting for Romney, and 90% straight ticket voting for the president and the House, 89 for the president and the Senate. So there's not a lot of cross-party voting. And you say that they are more likely to have cross-party voting?
Well, the Latino attachment to the Democratic Party is not as strong as African American attachment. And in some places, Latino Republicans get significant support among Latinos because they, you know, their sets of issues are broad and diverse, and generally speaking, immigration reform is not high on the list of priorities, though lately it's been more so for a variety of reasons. So there's just more opportunity for Republicans to steal Latino votes, if you will, but I just don't see with the current conversation how that's going to happen.
And that was the strategy of George W. Bush and McCain when they came within one vote of passing an immigration bill. They wanted to get that passed and then reach out on conservative issues to Latinos.
Yeah, if I could add, I mean, for a multi-billionaire, Donald Trump is really shitty at math. You know,
Others they can't add up all the departments that they're going to get rid of either.
Right.
Commerce,
4 or 5,
commerce.
yes. But the point being, Republicans cannot win if we match or do worse than Mitt Romney did among Latinos. There's just not enough white voters. The percentage of the electorate that is white keeps going down every 4 years and going down significantly. Mitt Romney won 59% of white voters. He won 56% of white women in the last election. So you can't really push that number up, 59, much higher. He did better than George W. Bush did in 2000. Based on how Ronald Reagan did in 1980 when he won the White House, if he had been running in the same electorate that exists now, he would not have won. And he had a landslide election. So that just shows you how much things have changed. So Republicans either have to make it up with African Americans, which is highly unlikely because Anna's exactly right. They are not as prone to split their ticket under any circumstances. And I don't know, you know, if you haven't heard, but the first African American president was a Democrat. So they're not just going to, you know, lose that attachment just because he's not on the ticket. So Latinos are the only place that Republicans can do better. And in 2014, Republicans did significantly better, a net 15 points better among Latinos, and that helped. You know, it wasn't a national election per se, but nationally doing that much better. Still lost them, but instead of getting blown out, it was a closer loss, and that made the difference. So Donald Trump's messaging may appeal to a certain segment of the Republican primary electorate, but it's a surefire way to get crushed in a general election.
I'd like to move to the issue of the economy. It's interesting that we've gone from a 10% unemployment rate when Obama came in to a 5% unemployment rate with modest growth, with increases in small business rather than decreases. It looks like it's doing moderately well, but both parties are concerned about issues related to the economy. And of course, in the polls, the economy is number one. It usually is, slightly more than functioning of Washington. Talking to two pollsters and others, why is the economy still number one?
Well, if you want, yeah, we don't want to monopolize, so, but, hey, you know.
But yours is part of the keys.
Yes, well, okay. So quickly, it's true the unemployment rate is down and the stock market is up and there's been, you know, positive net growth most quarters, but wages are still stagnant. Cost of transportation, education, housing is still going up, so people don't feel any better, even though the macroeconomic indicators suggest that we are better. A lot of the jobs that people do have are not as good as the jobs they had before the recession, and a lot of people are working more than one job, so they may say they are working full-time, but they're actually working a couple part-time jobs. So the economy isn't working for, you know, most people. Even people who are middle class feel they're not so worried about paying the bills each month, but they don't feel secure. They don't feel like they can quit a job to start a new one because they're not sure that there's enough security around changing jobs. They don't feel like they can start a new business because they don't think there's enough security in the economy. So, you know, even among people who are better off and better educated, there's a sense that things are very tenuous. And I think it's obviously a big problem for Hillary Clinton.
So the answer is cut taxes, deregulate, and don't have a minimum wage. Is that right, Glenn?
Can I just add one thing? I know I said I would talk, one more thing though. If you look at 2008, 12, and 16, if you look at the most important issue, it's true that economy is number one, but it's gone down about 20 points. And the gap between economy and terrorism and others is much smaller. So it is still a dominant issue, but it is not as dominant as it was in the last two presidential elections.
Well, the functioning of government surprised me and trust in government down, but functioning of government in many of the Gallup polls is number two right now, which is why these non-politicians maybe are doing so well, because everybody's angry.
Yeah, no, that's part of it. I mean, Republicans in particular, given the strength of Trump and Carson combined as outsiders with no political experience, and then much less so, but Fiorina, you know, popping up every so often, you know, a lot of that is driven by the frustration of, look, we elected a Republican House, we elected a Republican Senate, and yet you're not doing anything to stop Obama, you know, doing what he wants with his policies. You know, they kind of don't get that the Democrats still have a huge say in what happens in the Senate floor each day. So they're a little bit divorced. So there's concern about this functioning government from Republicans that say that Republicans aren't doing enough in Washington to advance the conservative cause. You've got independents who feel like neither party has a clue on what ought to be done. And of course, the Democrats think that if Barack Obama thinks it, the House and Senate ought to pass it. So, you know, that's why I think you see that as a close number two issue behind the economy.
Because I'm a professor, I'm going to give you a pop quiz. Are you ready? How many times in the history of the Republican Party, since 1860, has it nominated someone with zero governmental experience? That is, someone who's never held a governmental office. How many times since 1860? Once, exactly. Got to go back to, very good. Give that man $10. Eisenhower was general. Herbert Hoover was Secretary of Commerce. Taft was Secretary. They all held important government positions. Only Wendell Willkie. And how did Wendell do? 45% of the vote. Of course, he was against Franklin Roosevelt. Now, precedents are made to be broken, but that is something to think about.
Jen.
Except the political environment now is fundamentally different than it's been in the past, not necessarily because people don't approve of the job that Congress is doing or that they don't trust government, but there's a 24-hour news cycle that reinforces those doubts nonstop. So if you have even the smallest propensity to believe that you don't like the way the establishment is handling things, it takes you about 3 seconds to find 24 hours worth of that message over and over and over again. And I think that's why I don't think that Ben Carson or Donald Trump is going to win this thing. But I think they're going to stick around a lot longer than any of us would have anticipated because they're from the outside and they're authentic. They're asses, but they're authentic in their assishness. Is that a word? I don't even know. And so that's what people, I think, are looking for, right? They're looking for somebody that is not the same old, and they're looking for somebody that's going to tell them the truth. And it doesn't matter if the truth is not true. Right? Like, that's the best part of this whole thing. It's truthiness. It is, right? And so they're communicating in what people perceive to be an honest way, which is the antithesis of what they perceive in Washington right now. And so I think that taking into account that context changes things a little bit just in terms of how long we're going to go before we probably do revert back to the status quo.
So in the textbooks, they say that the invisible primary is very important. Getting money and getting endorsements. I'd like any of you to jump in on this. How are they doing on the money race, all of them? And does money really matter in this so far? And what about endorsements? And people actually committed to, well, in case of Hillary, committed to Hillary well before the convention. What's going on? David.
Well, yeah, I think there was a significant story today written by my friend Shane Goldmacher over in Politico about the Republican spending race on ads. And there's a big difference between the effectiveness of super PAC spending in advertising and when it comes to direct campaign spending. There are anti-gouging rules that allow campaign committees to directly get much more bang for their buck. And you'll see that Rubio has already reserved ad time that is, I think, 4 or 5 points more efficient than the time that Jeb has reserved in some early states. So that's a big deal. You're starting to see some of the Republican establishment in terms of fellow senators shift to start coming out publicly for Rubio. You've seen a little bit of that so far. And I speak with plenty more members of the Republicans in Congress who privately kind of see this race in terms of, you know, Rubio and perhaps 1 or 2 other candidates like Kasich having any shot at winning a general election, but they're scared to come out in favor of them because they think that support in D.C. might actually backfire with the electorate. So there is that as well.
Anybody else on the money? I know your firms are getting some of the money in terms of survey research.
Money on the presidential level doesn't matter quite as much because of how much the news media covers and how much interest there is. So, you know, Donald Trump hasn't spent a ton of money, which is kind of ironic, but that's because he knows all he has to do is call up Fox News or CNN and they put him on live and they ask him some questions and he, you know, has fun sparring with them and, you know, it gets rebroadcast and it's, you know, what's called earned media in campaigns. So, you know, and look, I've always said that if you want to get rich in politics, own a TV station in a swing state. And yes, you are going to see in New Hampshire and South Carolina and Iowa, you know, the airwaves more and more flooded, but they don't matter quite as much. It's much more what happens on the ground.
Just a second, on this point, just a little data. The last cycle in 2012, on average, 6 million people watched these preliminary debates during the primary sector. It's 23 million this time. These networks and cable outfits are jacking up their rates. They're making millions from this. And some would say it's more entertainment than true debate about policy, especially the first 3 debates for the Republicans. Yes.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about money. Obviously, my system is geared to general elections. And one quick word, you know, unless your theory of how elections work predict elections in advance, you can't put any stock in any theory. People can talk a lot. A friend of mine said he's really good at predicting the results of elections that have already happened. But unless you have a track record in advance, then there is no reason to believe any theory. I have no money key in general elections. Money makes no difference. It's non-predictive. Franklin Roosevelt in 1936 was outspent 2-1. He won 61% of the vote. You can cite example after example where money is going to give you the wrong prediction. And by the way, so are all of these early polls. Not only are early polls non-predictive, they're negatively predictive.
So he just wiped out 2 pollsters,
Four, yeah.
the entire campaign staff, the ground operation in Iowa and New Hampshire, and the field at political science.
And I have a limo waiting for me to whisk me out of here as soon as this is over.
He's in another building. He's not in our building. The School of Public Affairs really is a little more subtle about these things than you.
They wouldn't let me near that building. Are you kidding?
So there are many people in the audience that have run campaigns, that are running them now, pollsters. There's some media people here. We welcome all of you, students, faculty. I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. It's usually much more interesting than these staid questions at the very beginning. Absolutely.
So I feel like as the director of the Women in Politics Institute, I also have to give you just a very quick scenario moving forward. We know that we're pretty sure there's going to be a female presidential candidate, but it's also very unlikely that we won't see some increases in Congress this time too. And so I just wanted to note that there are currently 8 members of the House, 8 female members of the House that have decided that they're not seeking re-election. To keep the number at 19% representation in the House, 8 is not a high number to have to overcome. There are 5 women in the Senate who are either retiring or who are up for re-election. The 2 that are retiring, Barbara Mikulski and Barbara Boxer, are likely going to be replaced with other women. Lisa Murkowski and Patty Murray are not in difficult races. And Kelly Ayotte, who's up, is running against Maggie Hassan. So that's going to probably be at least a wash. There's a strong female candidate running in Nevada, too, for an open seat. So chances are, in Illinois, Tammy Duckworth. So chances are that we'll just see a lot of what we've seen in the past, where it'll be these glacial increases, but there's nothing to suggest that there would be any kind of net setback this
Hey,
time.
big headline. You just told us Donna Edwards is going to beat Chris Van Hollen for Barbara Mikulski's
Well,
seat in Maryland.
No, I
You
would.
said it should be replaced by a woman.
I said it's likely that they'll be replaced by a woman. Obviously, if you.
Oh, hedging.
No, it's not.
Come on, that's the
hedging.
headline here.
And so we clearly have different strategies of political analysis, and now we open it up to you.
So let's go to David. Before we go to the audience, let's talk a little bit about the House. Is it redistricted in such a way that we really are only going to have 30 to 40 seats that are competitive again?
You're absolutely right. We have 32 seats that we currently rate as competitive at the Cook Report. 14 of those are toss-ups. So we're talking about essentially 95% of the House.
Right.
That's a foregone conclusion before the election. And, I think Democrats, their chances of picking up seats are really good. But, if it's a fairly neutral election, probably in the 5 to 10 seat range. They need 30. If Donald Trump or Ben Carson or Ted Cruz is the nominee, maybe that gets in the 15 to 20 range. But I still don't see them within range, given that only 16 of 247 House Republicans won their elections in 2014 by 10 points or less.
Right.
If you'll permit me for a second, at the risk of being contrarian, I just want to go back to the demographic point for a second.
Yes.
I actually think that the role of Latino voters in 2016 is perhaps overstated. Consider for a minute that you pretended that 0 Latino voters had cast ballots in 2012. 0. President Obama would have lost the popular vote, but he still would have won the Electoral College 283 to 255. That's because Latino voters are predominantly concentrated in safe states like California, Texas, New York, et cetera. Only 49 Electoral College votes in battleground states are states where Latinos make up more than 10% of the vote. So I think the question in 2016, both at the House level and at the presidential level, is whether Democrats can continue to engage millennials and African Americans. And those are 2 demographic questions that I think are really open at this point.
Okay, good. By the way, we're having a half-day forum seminar on the Latino vote in 2016 on April 29th. We're bringing in experts from February 29th. Bringing in experts from around the United States. We're doing it jointly with the Center for Latino and Latin American Politics here. And you'll get an invitation for that. Let's go to the audience for questions. Let's go right here, please.
What is the Likely, okay, thank you. Likely impact, or is there one, on the current events today with ISIS or ISIL?
What's the impact of the tragedy in Paris is another way to put it, and the ISIS attack in Paris.
Well, Paris happened on Friday, so we don't have a lot of polling data yet. But I would say two things. One, it's true that terrorism and national security is a more important issue this cycle, but it's primarily because it's at the top of the list for Republicans. If you look at it by party, it's pretty close to the bottom for Democrats, and it's sort of in the middle to low range for independents. But it's the number one issue for Republicans, at least in the polling that I've seen. The question is an open question whether or not what's happened in Paris makes it a broader base of people for whom this is an important issue. First of all, I think it depends. I mean, the election's a year from now. And if there isn't much else that happens, then I think it dissipates. I mean, people's memories are pretty short. And I think people are generally more concerned about what's happening in their daily lives. So if there's no personal impact, there isn't some massive change, there isn't something that happens here, my guess is it recedes, and it still is part of the election, but I don't think it's going to be the number one issue across party. The other thing that I would mention is, I just lost my train of thought completely.
Well, we can,
Terrorism.
yeah, we can go to
Okay.
Glenn for a second. And Glenn, it seems like the Republican Party is, the candidates in the Republican Party don't have a clear message about what to do about it, right?
Sorry, I now remember. I also think that there's a really dangerous thing going on right now with the Syrian refugees. Leaving aside the moral dimension of this, it really has very quickly politicized something that I think everybody in America feels, terrible about, and it makes it kind of a partisan political issue. You have not just, Trump and others, but you have these Republican governors, and that saying that. Yeah, Maggie Hassan. But most of the Democrats who have said something, Inslee and Wolf, say, they'll take the refugees. Regardless, it doesn't matter. It's just that it is instantly politicized and instantly partisan, which in some ways I think makes it harder for it to be kind of a shared concern across the electorate.
And a merger of the immigration issue with this issue. So
Yeah,
the
look,
Republican
I-
candidates don't seem to have one stand. There's Paul on one side, and everybody else is sort of in a shade of gray as to what to do.
Well, when you think about 50 Shades of Gray, you think of Republican candidates for president. Okay. I think what you're seeing with what the governors and many of the candidates are saying, and not all the governors, but many of them are saying about the Syrian refugees is, look, we can't take any chances that this is one way that ISIS is smuggling terrorists in. And, given how government operates sometimes, to sit there and think that they would all be found, as part of the vetting process, I think that's a little bit too optimistic. And of some people who think that, government can't make any mistakes ever, such as, it was the Homeland Security spent $1 billion and they have one form online. I mean, that was what they spent. They've spent $1 billion to get one form, or maybe it's immigration, INS or DHS. It's one of the two. And I mean, the Washington Post just reported this last week. So I think the big concern is we can't. This is something you can't make a mistake on, and just to automatically say we're going to welcome them with open arms and trust the government to thoroughly vet them, I think that's a huge mistake.
To put
I've
this
gotta
in,
weigh in on
wait a
this,
minute,
yeah.
put this in context,
Yeah.
the Syrians that are coming to the United States most of them are from Jordan. They've been in camps for many years. They've been vetted very thoroughly. They're not people who've just come across the ocean to Greece and have just arrived. So it's a different kind of situation, I think.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that all 10,000 or 65,000 are, not a problem.
I have to weigh in on this because, as Jim said, my last book was FDR and the Jews. And during World War II, guess what critics of immigration were saying? We can't let any of those Jewish refugees into the United States because the Nazis are going to plant spies and saboteurs and terrorists among them. And today, the American government is roundly condemned for not letting the Jewish refugees into the United States. I'm not saying it's exactly analogous, but it is chillingly familiar and is something for you all to think about.
Next, Mark Nadell, not Leif Richler. Sorry.
Thank you. In the introductions, Jim had mentioned that David had done some work on delegate selection, which leads to my question. I think all of you have either said or implied that at the end of the day, it ain't going to be Carson or Trump. I would like any of you, but particularly David, to explain to me the arithmetic of that happening when, you know, if one or both of them start winning primaries, coming in 1, 2, in either order, and continue winning primary. What I don't, one thing, and let me just add, what I don't understand is whether the Republicans have anything analogous to the superdelegates that the Democrats have, so that the quote establishment can come in and basically trump everyone else, so to speak.
Thanks for the question. Republicans do have something analogous, although it's not as great a share of the total delegate pool. Democrats have close to 4,700 delegates, out of which 713 are superdelegates, so approaching 20%. Republicans have 2,472 delegates, and there are somewhere between 150 and 210 automatic delegates. They're not called superdelegates, but they may have some personal sway over the process by virtue of their positions as RNC committee people and state chairs. You know, national polls that drive the media narrative of this race are not an accurate portrayal of the race for many different reasons, but I think the foremost is that they're testing for a race that will never take place. We don't hold one national primary in which everyone gets an equal vote. It's a long slog for these 2,472 delegates. And when you break down how they're allocated by state, the math gets pretty interesting. There are 834 delegates, about a third of the total, that are awarded based on who is ahead in each congressional district in states that award it that way. What's fascinating is that each of 272 congressional districts gets 3 delegates to the Republican National Convention. But it doesn't matter whether that district's a heavily Republican district or a heavily Democratic district. So for example, if you're a Republican presidential primary voter in the Bronx, where there were only 5,000 Romney voters in New York's 15th district in 2012, well, your vote could be worth 43 times as much as a voter casting a ballot in Alabama's 6th congressional district, which had 233,000 Romney voters. In fact, if you average all the blue state Republican congressional delegates at stake, each blue district averages 28,000 Romney voters in the 2012 election, compared to 56,000 Romney voters in red congressional districts where these delegates are at stake. The long and short of this is that if you are a candidate like Cruz or Trump or Carson, and you're racking up big delegate shares perhaps in some of the early proportional states that are participating in the SEC primary on March 1st, you could wind up with a delegate lead coming out of early March. But later in the process, if you're a more pragmatic candidate like a Rubio or a Jeb Bush or a Kasich, you could make up that margin quite easily by winning not only more moderate winner-take-all states like Florida and Ohio, but also by sweeping coastal and urban congressional districts where Republican voters are more pragmatic and more moderate. Because those Republican voters in heavily blue states, well, guess what? They're almost extinct in Washington because their candidates lose general elections to Democrats. But the hidden key to their success in nominating relative moderates like McCain and Romney in the last 2 presidential cycles is that they've had a huge sway over the Republican nomination process thanks to delegate allocation. Sorry for the ramble.
He summarized a very excellent article in a very short period of time. It's a great article. I recommend it. I'm going to go to Lee Fritzler, then to others. Lee was the dean of the School of Public Affairs at one time, and he hired me, so I have to call on him.
Yeah, very smart move on my part. Alan, I hope Roosevelt and the Jews is in fact not your last book, as you indicated that it was. I was struck by something Jennifer Lawless said, and it seems to me maybe it got lost or has been lost in these conversations. Is the world so different today from what it was 4 or 8 years ago in terms of media coverage and the constant media coverage we get 24 hours a day, where some of the information put out there is absolutely nuts. I mean, I'm thinking of the one that accuses Obama, 30% of the American people, or is it 40, think that he's a Muslim. I mean, does this, have things changed so dramatically in this regard that history isn't much of a guide to what's going to happen in the future?
Well, yes, the way people consume media has changed dramatically, and it's still changing. It's moving at a rapid speed. Each election cycle, the amount of money that is spent on digital campaigning compared to, TV and direct mail and radio, it's increasing significantly. And that's one of the reasons, along with the higher costs of reaching voters overall, you're seeing campaign spending increase, is because all this stuff to reach voters is much harder. And it's also harder to reach voters. It used to be that you could run a TV ad for what's called 500 gross rating points, and then you would switch out that ad. And then it went to 700, and now it's probably 1,500, 1,200, 1,500 points before you get enough views that your message is sunk in with those who are seeing it. And of course, there's a lot of people who don't even see it. They're consuming content on their phone, their tablet, their laptop, or what have you. If they're consuming, and they're searching for things, they're in control of what it is that they're interested in as well. So, the old where articles in the newspapers used to matter. Now it only matters if it's used by campaigns to run against somebody or take a shot at somebody. So yeah, things have changed dramatically, and the evolution is not finished by any stretch.
Glenn, I'd like to add to it that we have really sound scholarship showing the polarization of the media. We have sorted and polarized voters. We've got a highly polarized Congress, but we have a polarized media also, where people go to the media that they agree with, and many of our students don't watch TV, they don't read papers except online, and they go to places that they agree with, and that reinforces this polarization. Jen.
The one thing that's a little bit different about presidential versus down-ballot races, though, is that local newspapers are still the main source of news consumption for congressional races. So at the presidential level, it's become sort of like the wild, wild west of political reporting, and the information environment has gotten huge, and journalistic norms that used to rein reporters in are less relevant. But even though we've seen a decline in local newspapers and the death of many of them, at the congressional level, there still does tend to be a little bit more substantive reporting. And in fact, in the 2014 House elections, on average, each election, each district saw in their local newspaper about 13 newspaper articles in the month leading up to the election. So that's a decent amount of substantive coverage. It's just that when we get to the presidential level, there it becomes very, very easy to select into the news sources that most agree with you or that are the most outrageous.
I think the biggest impact is the polarization of the media, because it reinforces the polarization in the electorate. The strongest predictor of how you're going to vote is what party you belong to. And there was an interesting article in the Monkey Cage last week, an analysis of the ANES from 2012 that shows there's, over time, fewer and fewer persuadable or swing voters. So I think it's, it hasn't changed things dramatically in terms of outcomes, but what it has done is make party and partisanship so locked in that there's almost nobody left who's a persuadable voter. It's almost all about getting your base out to the polls.
With the spirit of getting more questions in, Ella, I'm sorry, I'm going to ask for the next question.
Thank you. I have a gender question. With Benghazi, with the emails and all of that, I was concerned when I heard that Hillary Clinton was losing white women. What's that all about?
The women are debating who's going to take the question.
Right. Because we're women, we don't just talk over each other. We actually negotiate who's going to answer the question. I think you have to make a distinction between Democratic primary voters and the general electorate. As Glenn noted, Romney won a majority of white women in 2012. So I expect whichever Republican, well, not whichever, assuming a pragmatic and more moderate Republican is nominated, I assume they will win a majority of white women. I think what was reported on was that she was losing ground with women among Democratic primary voters, But what you see in the time series data is post-debate in Benghazi, she's right back where she was. By the way, she's also winning, about half of men in the Democratic primary. So, obviously the Democratic primary electorate is majority female. It's about 55%. In heavy African-American states, it's about 60% female. She's winning about 60% of the women's vote, so in the primary. So again, it's hard to see how she loses. But just keep in mind, she's also getting about 45% of men in the Democratic primary as well. So I think we just have to be careful not to conflate the Democratic primary electorate with the general electorate, which is going to be much more stable and much more consistent with historic trends.
Just one thing to add to that, and this links back to the media point. It's a sexy story if the data can be, no pun intended, it's a sexy story, if the data can be sort of portrayed as, oh my gosh, Hillary Clinton has a crisis among female voters, right? And then that links back to the 2008 primary and whether she should have outperformed Barack Obama among female voters, especially in some of the early states. So what Anna's saying is exactly right. And, there's not always complete context or responsible reporting linked to, some of these analyses.
Let's go to the next question.
Yes, thank you. I'm surprised that you haven't spoken more about turnout. And I'm wondering what estimates are for what the 2016 turnout may be in contrast to the Obama wave in 2012, and also whether you have any sense of whether voter ID laws are going to have impacts in swing states, battleground states.
I think the fight over voter ID laws has actually hurt Republicans enormously. And I think it's ramped up African-American enthusiasm in a variety of swing states. I'm in the process of putting together, along with a couple other quantitative journalists, a demographic swingometer, an interactive tool that should be live on 538 in early December that will allow you to adjust turnout levels for various demographic groups and estimate their impact on the outcome in swing states. As I mentioned before, one of the early conclusions that I made from the kind of beta tested model of this swingometer is that even if you drop Latino turnout to 0, Democrats would still win the election. But if you go back to a 2004 type of simulation, where African American turnout drops from about 66%, where it was in 2012, to only 60%. That would have a huge impact on Democratic margins in a variety of very important states: Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida. What's amazing to me is that just 3 counties out of 3,114 counties in the country reelected Obama in 2012. If you pretended for a moment that Broward County, Florida, Cuyahoga County, Ohio, and Philadelphia County, Pennsylvania did not exist, Barack Obama would have lost all 3 of Florida, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, and without those votes, he would have lost the election. Without those electoral votes, he would have lost the election to Mitt Romney. And so Democrats, I think, were able to win in 2012, not by capitalizing on Obama's first term necessarily, but by juicing up turnout, in particular by making Romney unacceptable. And I think their ability to excite their core base will depend in large part on making the alternative in 2016 really out of touch and unacceptable.
And by the way, touching on what David pointed out, that's one of the reasons that you've got the 2 conventions this next year. One of them's the Democrats are in Philadelphia, and the Republicans are in Cleveland, which is Cuyahoga County, because those, and again, it's not like Republicans are going to suddenly win Cuyahoga. In fact, I don't think where you have your convention really matters at all in terms of how a state votes. But, every effort's important, and it's not that you have to win Cuyahoga, Republicans have to win it, but they have to cut the margins by which they're being crushed by. I mean, Mitt Romney won the rest of Ohio by about 150,000 votes. He didn't win every county, but if you add up every other county, but because Obama won Cuyahoga by such a big margin, he won Ohio. And the same's true, I haven't looked at Broward, but same's true of Miami-Dade as well, in Florida, and Philadelphia, and Pennsylvania. So, you're going to see Republican efforts to try and cut those margins. At the same time, look, what's the first thing that Hillary Clinton's going to have in her general election plan? Number 1 thing is turn out African American voters. And the number 2 thing is turn out other minority voters.
So I want to push back a little bit on the premise of the question and also your answer to some degree. If you look at 2008 and 12, turnout was not up all that much. I think it was about a point higher in 2008 than it was in 2004, and I believe it was flat in 12. Now, there was a difference among groups, African-American turnout was higher in '08 and '12 than '4, but overall turnout wasn't, so this vaunted turnout machine that Obama's campaign sort of, they're sort of famous for, didn't have all that much impact on turnout. The strongest predictor of turning out was, did you vote before? So I don't think turnout as a whole is going to be all that different in 2016 in terms of the overall percentage of the electorate that turns out. I am very skeptical there'll be any decline in African-American turnout, no matter what the Hillary Clinton campaign does. Since 2010 in particular, the Republican Party has been so bad on issues facing African-Americans that I think the party is completely tarnished, no matter who they nominate. I don't think that Hillary Clinton's going to have to do all that much to get African-American voters out. African-American turnout was not down in 2014, which is kind of surprising in a midterm. To your point, the voter ID laws, but now Black Lives Matter, and now all the xenophobia coming out of the Republican Party, I don't see any evidence that there'll be declining African-American enthusiasm just because Barack Obama is not on the ticket. So again, I don't think turnout changes all that much from year to year. The main change in the last 2 cycles was higher African-American turnout, and I don't see any reason why that would go down.
So from FDR until, we had a whole conference on turnout, and Jan Legley ran it yesterday, experts from all over the United States, a great conference. And so she could go on for a long time about turnout, but we do know at the presidential level that turnout from FDR until Obama was 55%. In 2008, it was 60.1%, and about that in 2012. Some argue, and maybe Jan, you can jump in on this, some argue that early voting had a great deal to do with that, which is related to the last question, because there's pushback on early voting in many of these states, in 31 states. Any reactions to the impact of early voting on turnout? And Jan, feel free to jump in here if you want.
So I was at this conference yesterday for about an hour, but I actually heard analysis of this. So Jan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense is that early voting, longer periods of early voting, the days that the polls are open, none of this really seemed to matter or affect voter turnout, right?
How about day of registration, day of election day
so
registration? Like Minnesota.
Yes, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I think the sense that I got from this conference yesterday was, you need to motivate people to turn out, but the whole thing is about actually getting them to believe that it's necessary for them to turn out and that their circumstances merit a vote. I mean, we've reached the point where in a lot of states right now, it's actually quite easy. We hear about a lot of the restrictions, and that's true, and that's certainly a problem, but in the states where we've made it, fundamentally easier, we haven't seen the kinds of increases I think that most people would have expected initially.
So let's go to Jan. I was there for 2 hours, not an hour and a half.
Thank you, Jim. I'll add a footnote to what Jen said from the conference yesterday, where we had some really outstanding political scientists in. And through a variety of methods and data over decades, the early voting consequences are, it's a change in mode. Instead of individuals who would otherwise vote on election day, they'll show up early because it's easier. But it doesn't increase the absolute level of turnout. Absentee voting has given us something over 40 years from the 70s on, 2 or 3 percentage points. So that's important. And election day registration, anywhere from 3 to 6. So it was stunning after all these expert analyses to see that the policies do matter. They don't turn the world upside down, but they matter. But the key is how the campaigns, but I think our takeaway from yesterday was how advocacy groups, how civic engagement groups, they have to take advantage of those laws, and they have to try to reach out to people who wouldn't otherwise vote. The parties are only going to spend most of their resources. This is where Anna and Glenn can step in and say more. They're primarily targeting people who already vote. That's who they have the data on. And that's, I think, the best use of their resources.
So do
right?
campaigns
They want
matter?
to turn out the base.
Do campaigns matter?
Yeah, and political scientists give some space for campaigns. Issue framing, conveying positive candidate images, a wide variety of things that
Good.
and they talk about a lot of those other factors, Alan. So in any case, it's not political
So 30
science
years
today.
of our Campaign Management Institute has done some good, maybe.
It's done great work.
Your career has been validated.
A couple of states, California and Oregon, have passed automatic voter registration laws, as did the legislature in New Jersey, but the bill was vetoed by Christie. And Democrats are now pushing in other democratically controlled states, there aren't that many, but there are a few still, to pass these laws. Do you think it's possible as a result of this, particularly given California, where they're predicting it's going to be well over 1 million more voters, will that increase the possibility in a close election of one candidate winning the popular vote while the other wins the Electoral College? And what will another one of those elections do to the body politic?
Alan, would you like to take this one?
Not really, but I've got a couple of things I want to say, actually, that are related to this, but not exactly. I take my wisdom entirely from the late, great Rosanna Dana of Saturday Night Live, when she said, there's always something. History is always changing. Yes, today there's, more minorities voting, the media is different, but look, tens of millions of women were enfranchised in 1920. Millions of African Americans enfranchised in 1965. Until recently, there was no television, no radio, no polls, no jet planes. My ancestors weren't even here in the 19th century. And yet the same keys that predicted Obama-Romney predicted Lincoln-Douglas back in 1860. In other words, there are constant factors in history. And I'm constantly being told, oh, but things are different now because of X, Y, Z. Things are always different. That's why if you're doing prediction, you've got to look at what is robust, what doesn't change, even when all of these things are changing, because none of these changing things predict anything at all. Let me give you another example. A lot of the panelists have said, oh my gosh, if the Republicans nominate an extreme candidate like Donald Trump, they're going to be destroyed. I remind you, as an historian, that's exactly what the critics said about the nomination of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Oh my God, if the Republicans nominate Ronald Reagan, he's so extreme, they're going to be destroyed. Take all of this stuff with a huge grain of salt.
But we went to a convention where Ronald Reagan and Ford went into the convention. They didn't know who was going to win. So in other words, he ran once before as a former governor and did pretty well. So
That was in a Republican primaries.
yeah, right. So, he was tested. But let's go to another question from the audience. Yes, sir, right here. And I'd like a question from a younger student. Sorry.
That's very kind of you. I work for Euronews, European television, and in Europe there are two candidates that are known to broader audiences. One is Hillary Clinton and one is Donald Trump. And in my reports, I usually say that Donald Trump is the front runner because of a deep-rooted mistrust among the Republican base. I also say that pundits and experts always say that he's not going to make it. I wonder whether this is true. Why are you so sure that he's not going to become the nominee? What about these discontent Republicans? Does that feeling just disappear? And why would they suddenly flock to mainstream candidates? And do you totally exclude a third-party run of Donald Trump in case he doesn't make it?
So I think he won't make it because I actually believe in the American people. But I'm sorry, I did my partisanship just a little bit. But so I think there are two important factors. The first is that although the field is still so crowded, that even a couple of early wins by him, should that happen in Iowa and New Hampshire, a lot of these other candidates still stay, they're still viable. And if any one of them becomes a consistent and steady third place alternative, I think at that point, support from the other candidates might then start to coalesce behind that more mainstream option, right? So at this point, it's all hypothetical. My sense is that once a win is in the column of either Trump or Carson, it's possible that people might start to think, oy, right? That's technical. The other thing I would keep in mind is that, we've also gotten to the point where there is deep mistrust of the establishment But there's still quite a bit of time for some of these other candidates to show that they're not part of the establishment, right? It's hard to frame Marco Rubio as the same kind of person as, Jeb Bush or anybody else. And as we've seen, over the weekend, we don't know from the polling data yet, but if terrorism continues to be an important issue, I think we saw from the Democratic debate on Saturday night, the fact that Bernie Sanders was not that able to talk about it in an authentic, experienced way could ultimately hurt some of these candidates on the Republican side. So I just think it's too early, and a lot of the support that Trump has been getting and a lot of the attention that Trump has been getting is because he's a celebrity and not because he's a politician.
So my question is, why do Europeans think that Trump is entertaining?
Well, if he's, well, first of all, Donald Trump is the zombie of the presidential campaign. Every time you think he's dead because of something that he has said or done, it turns out he comes back just as strong. And that's certainly a little bit hard to project that, what would kill normal candidates, mistakes that would kill normal candidates don't seem to hurt Trump at all. I've no longer said he won't be the nominee. Because, I certainly did not expect him to have this much staying power this long. He won't be president. When you've got a 25 positive, 58 negative, you don't recover from that. You might get a little bit better, but more than likely not. If he's not the nominee, he's not going to run third party because he'll be so unhinged and blaming the American public for their stupidity, because he's such a huge, great guy, awesome guy, that he just won't have the heart to go ahead.
Plus, it's very hard to get on the ballot in all the states as a third and fourth party. The parties control that in their state legislatures, and they set it up so that's where they agree. They set it up so it's only two parties, so it's almost impossible to run as a third party candidate this late and do well. Shall we go to another, David?
Oh, I was just going to add quickly that who was ahead at this point in 2011? Herman Cain. I mean, I don't think we're historically out of line here.
I just want to say, Stefan, I am on record as dissenting with all of this and saying Trump is not better than 50%, but if you look at all the nominees, he is the most likely to be nominated. I've been saying this for 4 months now.
I thought you were going to give us the keys again.
Can we hold you to that?
Okay, all right.
Yeah, right here. Well, wait a minute. I'd like to go to a woman first, please.
Oh, because I'm a woman. Okay. Okay, so I'm a student of both Professor Lichtman and Professor Lawless. So I'm trying to bridge the gap between the two theories here. So my question is to you, Professor Lichtman. You say that your prediction is based on how the party is doing and the incumbent, but two of your keys depend on how they are seen in the public, their charisma. So how do you bridge the gap between that and saying that it's all in history?
Brilliant question. I'm leaving. Can't answer that. No. Obviously, what I'm saying is, in very rare occasions, the candidate can matter. That's why I talk about candidate charisma. It is a very, very high bar. There's only a handful of candidates who ever made it. And you know who they are: Ronald Reagan, Franklin Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, William Jennings Bryan. So this is kind of the... Cal Coolidge, Richard Nixon. This is kind of, the extraordinary, unusual, once-in-a-generation candidate who makes people think beyond everything else and inspires them above and beyond themselves. So that's how I reconcile it. And by the way, I'm an historian. I'm allowed contradictions, double standards, judgments, all of that stuff.
And anecdotes.
Anecdotes, you name it. Rosanna Dana.
Let's go to this question right here, please. Sir.
Hi, my name is Karol. I'm European from Poland. I'm here as a visiting research fellow. And answer to the question, why do you think Trump is funny? Because we tend to think that Americans are stupid. So that's the first answer. We just like to feel much better about ourselves because...
And that's why so many of them come here to go to study.
Exactly, yeah. That's why I came here, to understand what the hell is going on here. And I run away from Poland because now we have far right-wing government that I'm ashamed of. That's why I'm here. But that's the question. We also think he's funny because he appeared in Jimmy Kimmel and Jimmy Fallon show. shows, and that's important for us. That's how we learn about political culture in states. And my question to you would be, because that's the question I'm looking an answer for, because from my perspective, Bernie Sanders is perceived here as a radical. He's completely not radical for Europeans in general. So when I speak to people who tend to support Democratic Party, most of them say, yeah, Bernie Sanders is right. We really agree with him, but we are not going to vote for him because we will lose our vote like this. So my question is to you as an expert, to all of you, why Bernie Sanders is not electable in states and within Democratic
So Bernie
Party?
Sanders calls himself a social democrat, but by all standards in the world, he's a progressive Democrat, a liberal Democrat, right?
Let's be clear, he just registered as a Democrat.
Right.
So it's a problem. I mean, it is a problem that he was not actually a Democrat, that he was actually, I don't know if he registered as a socialist in Vermont, but he literally changed his registration.
right.
To progressive to become a Democrat. I don't think there's two things. I mean, one, I just think in the way he comports himself and his level, even though he's been in office forever, he's not really an outsider. I mean, he was in Congress before, he was in the Senate, and I believe he was in the legislature or a mayor right?
Mayor.
So he's been in elected office for most of his life. So even though he seems like an outsider, he's actually not an outsider. So I think that first, just his personality is not, I think, a general electorate personality. And I would also note what Jen just said about foreign policy. I think it's very difficult for him he's really good at expressing kind of outrage and criticizing the system. I don't think he's as good at sort of being presidential and people feeling confident that he would be a good president. So I think in terms of the general electorate, I think he's got some personality issues, the charisma issue for Bernie Sanders. I think for Democratic primary voters, it is so important for Democratic primary voters to win. Most people are not strategic voters. Most people vote based on their party. But within primaries, you actually see some strategic voting, which is to say, I like Bernie, but I'm voting for Hillary because I think she can win. And you may see some of that happen in the Republican primary as well, as Jen was talking about. So I think both because I think he's too kind of nuts for the general election. It's not that he's too left-wing. A lot of what he says, about Wall Street, huge majorities support his point of view. But I think he seems too nuts. And, I think that and not serious enough to kind of take on the big problems. And I think Democrats want to win. Can I go back to Trump for a minute? He may be the nominee. I will not make a prediction. But it is true, when you look at the data, most of these polls are not actually, they're national, which means they're meaningless, but they're also mostly not conducted from voter file, the public polls. They're conducted through random digit dial or other lists they buy, but they're not calling from the list of registered voters because it's more expensive to do that. So what a real poll would do would be pull people who are likely Republican primary voters from voter file and talk to them. So we've done some of this, and the thing about Trump's support is it's more likely to be independent leaning. It's not very religious. They are low information voters. All that suggests they're less likely to turn out in a primary. So the strongest predictors of turnout is obviously voting before, but also education level, how partisan you are. So high information partisan voters are much more likely to turn out. And Trump doesn't actually, that's not his base of support. It's a low information, kind of angry, non-ideological group, and they're not strong partisans. And so that will hurt him, particularly I think in the later primaries if he starts wearing on the primary electorate. I think his vote's not an easy one to get out.
And with that, we're out of time. I want to thank the panelists. I'd also like to thank Barbara Romzak for supporting these events. We're going to have 3 of them on the election. Next one is on Latino vote, and then another one in March. I promised the university chaplain not to have a prayer, but to announce that President Neil Kerwin and Joe Eldridge right here are having a 50th anniversary dedication of the K Spiritual Life Center. That's the center out here with the flame on the top of it. Tomorrow, Wednesday, November 18th at 2 p.m., you're all invited. Thank you very much, everybody.